Well, hello, everyone. I'm Tiana Ellington, Assistant Director of Chapter and Regional Programming with the Alumni Association of Case Western Reserve University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you.
Hi, I'm Christal Crosby. I'm the Assistant Director of Student and Young Alumni and Affinity Programs with the Alumni Association, and I'm also glad that you're here too.
Thank you for joining us this evening, and we hope that you and your loved ones have been staying healthy and safe. Before we begin our conversation, just a few housekeeping notes. Everyone coming in has been muted by default to cut down on background noise. However, once we start the conversation, everyone will be able to unmute themselves freely to participate. If for any reason you do not feel comfortable speaking to the group, you can add comments and questions to the chat below and we will read them out loud for you. And we hope that everyone feels that this is a safe space as we welcome your participation at any level that you're comfortable with. If you would like us to address you directly during the discussion, please make sure your name appears correctly in the meeting, and you can rename yourself by clicking on the Participants tab, finding your name, and then using the More option and selecting Rename. And just a few quick updates from campus before we get started. The spring semester is now underway with students studying in person, remotely, or a combination of those formats. Their safety and well-being has been the university's top priority, and careful measures have allowed CWRU to continue its educational and research priorities. In fact, in the response to the pandemic, Case Western Reserve's research has become vital to the fight against COVID-19. We invite you to follow us on Facebook and the university's website, case.edu/together, for regular updates on researchers, academics, alumni, and students. Additionally, in support of the ongoing conversation about race, equality, and social injustice in our country, Case Western Reserve University has launched a race, police, and protest website found at case.edu/race and justice. It provides statements from the university leadership, as well as university resources, and the opportunity for members of the community to share their thoughts. The university acknowledges that the day's most profound questions require work and ongoing communication, and we look forward to sharing future progress. At the Alumni Association of Case Western Reserve, we continue to use our platforms to promote connections within the CWRU community and to present information and opportunities to all. Please continue engaging with us by following us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn by searching at CWRU Alumni, and visit case.edu/alumni for a collection of current events and recordings of past programming that can be accessed at any time. Now more than ever, we hope these virtual events and social media platforms will help us to stay connected. And thank you for being a part of this evening's event. Throughout this month, the Alumni Association, in collaboration with the Cleveland Institute of Arts Cinematheque, is proud to host the virtual film slam featuring independent films and in-depth discussions with CWRU experts. Additionally, we would like to use this film series to highlight the CWRU Film Society, a student organization celebrating 50 years on campus. The Film Society is a nonprofit student-run organization dedicated to the promotion of film as an art form, making films of artistic and cultural importance, as well as popular films available to the university community. Reflecting the spirit of the Film Society's mission to share films of cultural importance, each of the independent films selected for our series showcase critical issues currently impacting the country. And I'd like to turn it over to one of the Film Society students here this evening, Kristina Collins.
Thanks very much, Tiana. I really appreciate the chance to tell people a little bit about our organization. As she said, Case Film Society has been around for just about 50 years. We hold screenings in Strosacker Auditorium, and we are one of the relatively few theaters remaining in Northeast Ohio that still has 35 millimeter film, along with our friends over at the Cinematheque. And I've included some links in the chat with some information about us, including our homepage. During the pandemic, our screenings are open to members of the Case community, so students, faculty, staff, and alumni. You can sign up for them on campus groups, and we have temperature checks at the door and require COVID tests along with regular university policies, which are also available on the website. This weekend, we're showing Despicable Me tomorrow night. I think it's 7 and 9 p.m. We usually have 3 showings on Friday, 2 on Saturday. Our showing on Saturday will be a documentary film called Biggest Little Farm, and that's going to be in co-sponsorship with the Case Farm. So we have some wonderful events going on, and we look forward to being able to welcome the public back in the fall. And we hope that at some point you'll join us to hang out or learn to project 35 millimeter film or come see a movie. All right, and with that, thank you again very much. Tiana, back to you.
Thank you, Kristina. Our film discussions are led by CWRU faculty or staff members with particular knowledge or background to the film's key themes. We hope you've all been able to see test patterns. However, if you haven't had a chance yet, don't worry. We aren't going to be discussing the specific plot points in the story, but more so the broader issues raised by the film. And with that said, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sarah Ferrato. She is a community advocate with a focus on intersectional, equity-based access for marginalized communities throughout Cleveland. Currently, they serve as the education coordinator of the Flora Stone Mathers Center for Women at Case Western Reserve University. In this position, they research, develop, and deliver power-based violence and gender equity educational programming, as well as work collaboratively with the campus and Cleveland community to strengthen holistic efforts to combat sexual violence. Previously, they served as a school health educator with the Ohio Center for Sex Education at Planned Parenthood of Greater Ohio, and founder and independent consultant of the Sexual Violence Prevention Program, 86 Sexual Misconduct, with the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center. Sarah Ferrato's efforts to provide sexual violence prevention education and support to the CWRU Greater Cleveland community is founded in a commitment to the liberation of all people from oppressive structures through evidence-based knowledge, access, and mutual aid. We'd like to also set the stage for this evening's viewing with the basic premise and plot for the film. Part psychological horror, part realist drama, Test Pattern follows an interracial couple whose relationship is tested after a Black woman is sexually assaulted and her white boyfriend drives her from hospital to hospital in search of a rape kit. Set against the backdrop of a national discussion around inequitable healthcare and policy, the Me Too movement and race in America, their story reveals the systematic injustices and social conditioning women face when navigating sex and consent within a patriarchal system. And with that, Sarah, if you would like to get started by maybe taking on one of the more critical issues raised by the film.
Sure. Thank you so much, Tiana and Christal, for having me this evening. I'm really excited to be here and just engage in a dialogue. I would love this to be, really interactive. So, if anything strikes you, please feel free to unmute or even be unmuted if your space is on the quieter side, so that we can be a little bit more organic in the way that we would be in person. So I really, invite you all to engage in a way that feels best for you. When we think about some of the critical points that were raised in that, in the film Test Pattern, some of the things that come to mind for me, and I would love to hear from you all about what that was too, is just the intersections of oppression and how that shows up in our society, particularly when we think about who is most impacted by sexual violence, and then also who often is the most likely to report. And those two things don't match up. So if we think about from a statistical standpoint, 80% of cases that are reported around sexual violence come from white women, so 80%. But the highest impacted by sexual violence are women of color, the highest being American Alaskan women and American Indian women, interestingly enough, and then followed pretty closely by mixed race women as well as Black women. So we're talking, there's an incredibly pervasive structural issue going on here. So I would be interested just to kind of sit back and hear from you all as well.
Question. It's interesting. You said American Indian women. Why do you know? Is there a reasoning behind that, or that's interesting? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Yeah. if we think about when we think about power structures, particularly in our country, right, and who has been pushed kind of the edges of our communities and are offered the least amount of support, system support, structural support, there's also a higher rate of alcoholism in American Indian communities and Indigenous communities, because there have been structural pieces put in place where it's driven Indigenous communities to essentially the edges of our country. They've been displaced, their land has been stolen, and the support systems are not in place that were promised to them in the treaties for the exchange of land. So we think about when there may be like abusive patterns going on in the community, that they don't have somewhere to go to talk about those issues and to seek support, right? And so then we see those perpetuated structural issues happening because it's such insular communities. So those are just some of the reasons why that the numbers sit so much higher for Indigenous women.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely.
I was really struck by, I guess, I was thinking about my language when I was thinking about how I might speak. Struck, that seems like not a good word to use in this setting. How the boyfriend really wanted to get justice for his girlfriend. And as you're speaking about the women who don't report and the lack of support for pretty much anyone who's not white, and then women in addition, I really didn't think about her in that way during the movie. I was more really moved by him and how he wanted justice for her.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a really interesting point to make too, because I think what the director did so beautifully was, and heartbreakingly, was to show how our good intentions post sexual violence take continued agency away from a survivor. So Renisha didn't get a say, right? Like she was just kind of dragged along for this process, the same way that she was basically had her agency taken away in the situation with, and I believe his name was Michael, the perpetrator. So she comes to a place where she feels safe to share this with Will, her partner. And oftentimes, I think when we think about the socialization of men, there is an action-based resolution oftentimes, because that feels tangible instead of having to sit in the emotion and sit in the realization. And it does feel incredibly poignant, right? That he springs into action, but it also speaks like volumes to how we can unintentionally continue to perpetuate trauma for survivors in those moments by not giving them an option.
Oh, I really appreciate you saying that and bringing that to the forefront for my attention.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've noted the same thing, Sarah and Paula, that you did, because I noticed that like she even at one point it was just like, I want to go. Like he wanted to call the police. She didn't want to make a police report. And then the heartbreaking scene for me was when like she's just kind of like on the floor, completely just defeated, you know. And at that point, I think they had been waiting. They were like, they were at the third hospital and had been waiting forever. And she's completely defeated, and how he really was there to kind of like advocate for her. But at the same time, like, I don't know, it's kind of too, like, I felt good, like similar to Paula, like I was glad that he was there to like spring into action. But then I felt bad for her because then, like you said, that agency was taken away from her. And so I'm curious, like, as to what when we see things of that nature before it even gets to the point, because speaking even to like her friend wasn't even in a position to even help her because she was under the influence. What do we as like bystanders, when we're seeing things of that nature happen, like what responsibility do we have to like help or try to prevent, you know, what happened to Renisha? Because they were in public at first.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's welcome to jump in on this.
Yeah.
That we all have kind of a different, I think, variations on the theme of what bystander means.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear kind of like, and everybody has different tools of intervention. That's what's so powerful about intervention, is that we all play a really critical role, and it can look very different. So I'd be interested to like, you know, if we're thinking about ourselves in this situation, like how might we have as bystanders looked at that situation and identified it as an emergency and then taken action?
I would say like, I noticed there were like other people in the bar and everything, but no one seemed like especially concerned with what was going on. Even I feel like at one point, Amber, the friend, was almost like falling over. She was so inebriated from the drugs that they had been given. And I know that like personally, I've been out in public and, you know, seen girls with, you know, who I at the time assume is their significant other, partner, someone that they know and have come with. But I've never sprung and I've never been like, oh man, she's, you know, way too drunk or she seems like she's out of it and I should do something about it. And I don't know if that comes from like, you don't want to like, what if I'm completely wrong and this is just her boyfriend and she does this all the time type of thing? Or what if, you know, I could be the difference between, you know, saving this girl from, you know, having an experience like Renisha. And I don't know how, other than just doing it, I don't know how one can figure out the situation, scenario or whatnot. Because you don't know that person and you don't know if this is, you know, how they usually, you know, react in this kind of situation. So I feel like it's hard to be a bystander, but after seeing something like this and just knowing everything that's going on, I would like to just be like, it doesn't even have to be something super aggressive. Just be like, hey girl, you know, how you doing? That, you know, that kind of thing, you know, like, you know, are you gonna, you know, do you want to go to the bathroom together type of deal? Because that could really make a difference between a traumatic evening in her life.
Yeah.
Yeah, you bring up such an important point too, is that's what intervention looks like, right? Sometimes I think we think it needs to be this kind of, you know, huge moment, this pivotal moment. And something that I think is really important with, so I use the language, and this is kind of different than like bystander intervention, is pro-social bystander behavior, because I think sometimes we identify ourselves as bystanders, and actually the very definition of bystander means that you stand around and don't do anything, you don't get involved. And the interesting thing is that people self-identify as bystanders. You're going to see a cat come around here shortly. So Monty's invested as well in this conversation. So the interesting thing about it is that when we talk about it as a behavior and not as an identity, it's kind of like allyship, that we can't self-identify as allies. The behaviors that we engage in, the conversations that we have, the actions that we carry out, and somebody else names us as that thing because we've engaged in that behavior, rather than it being an ongoing personal identifying marker. And so, yeah, you, Tiana, you spoke to an intervention tool that's distracting the perpetrator from the entire situation by engaging in a conversation with the targeted person directly, and getting in the way. And that's a really powerful way. And sometimes I think, you know, we can be so concerned about some of the social mores that come along with being wrong about a situation. And I try to turn it in the perspective of like, what's the worst that could happen if you were wrong, right? But what's the worst that could happen if you were right and didn't do anything?
That's an excellent point. I also kind of wondered if the lack of help or the lack of anything from anybody in the bar also played into the fact that they were women of color.
Yeah. When we don't see people, oftentimes intervention happens when we see ourselves in someone else. And I think that's one of the huge barriers to intervention is when we don't see a mirrored experience, we can't imagine that that could be their experience. And oftentimes I think, especially if we're talking about like deeply ingrained racism and patriarchal belief systems and white supremacy, that there is a tendency, especially through different archetypes, is that it's the strong Black woman, right? Like that she's not capable of this happening to her. And that also there's like a radical over-sexualization of Black women's bodies. And so like she was asking for it. Oh, that's like what she's into, right? And so these belief systems that we've kind of ingrained in our society are that there's only certain types of people who could perpetrate sexual violence, and there's only certain types of people who can be survivors or targets of sexual violence, which can be very dangerous beliefs.
I also had another question, having like I didn't know too much about the entire process, honestly, other than what I've seen on television. But I had never heard of a SANE nurse. And are those you required everywhere, or are they just you? I honestly, like I said, I had no idea that there was a special nurse with additional qualifications that needed to be involved in that process, and that if the movie is any indication that the process cannot go forward if that person is not available to do the kit.
I'd be interested to hear from everybody. Has anybody heard of the term SANE before? Okay, so vast majority no, which is interesting too, because it isn't widely known. And also like hospitals are not required to have programs. The interesting thing is that, so a SANE nurse, actually, the language has been updated, and it's interesting because there's still some contention and still some ways to change that, because sometimes that language, especially when you're trying to provide support to somebody who is struggling with mental health issues, it can be incredibly cueing. And so the updated language is forensic nurse examiner, so an FNE. It's a little less, I think, memorable in its acronym, but it does really do kind of an effective job of speaking to all folks who are in these situations. So the interesting thing is that FNE programs, forensic nurse examiner programs, are not necessarily required in hospitals. They work as part of a SART team. So a sexual assault response team. So they work alongside law enforcement as well as what we call like medical advocates and victims advocates. Not every hospital has them. The interesting thing is that in this situation, if they were unable to get a forensic nurse examiner within an hour's time, the protocol, typically speaking, and this changes hospital to hospital, but typically speaking, a primary care provider or a registered nurse should have qualifications to carry out the exam, because they provide oftentimes detailed step-by-step instructions as to how to carry out the exam. Obviously, the pro of having a forensic nurse examiner present is because they are specially trained in that trauma-informed care, specifically to engaging with survivors of sexual assault. But it was really interesting to see, and I'd be interested to hear from you all why you think there was that reticence. Now knowing that like a forensic nurse examiner didn't necessarily have to be present for them to carry it out.
I think that kind of makes me look at some of the runaround, if you will, that they went through unnecessarily. Like if just any nurse, you know, who was available after X amount of time could have come and administered the test, you know, why did they go through giving, you know, sending them to 3 different hospitals, giving them lists, you know, doing the runaround in that manner? It just, I don't know if it's, because I know that there's plenty of places where people just don't know the policies, don't know the protocol. So it could have been, you know, just something as innocent as that, you know, we don't know that we're supposed to, you know, divert to this plan B in this situation. Or it could have been, you know, a little more, you know, nefarious than that.
I kept wondering if it had to do with her being Black.
Yeah, I was thought the same thing, and because I was wondering, I couldn't quite tell where the movie was taking place, if it was like a rural community, or like, because obviously it wasn't like New York City or a major city, so I knew that, but it was kind of difficult to tell like where it was at the setting of the movie, and maybe that's because I thought that like because she was Black, or maybe they just didn't have access to like that kind of healthcare and like that and women's healthcare in those types of communities. So I couldn't tell either.
I think now I'm remembering like toward the end of the movie when she was driving past the police station, I think it said Austin.
Oh,
That's right.
Well, and they even had that conversation. Remember, her and Amber were talking in the bar before the 2 men approached about how she needed to get out of Texas too.
Oh, okay.
That was like a really poignant part that was like very quiet, right? Of like talking about kind of the culture there and the pervasiveness of like racism playing into her decision making for like not wanting to be in Texas anymore.
That's an excellent point.
That's an excellent point.
Especially with Austin too, right? Like Austin feels like a very progressive kind of island in the middle of a sea of red. But there was like this, sometimes we name it like as Midwest nice, of this reticence to help people who don't look like you, but like we're doing it in a nice way. So like, why are you upset with us? Felt very much like some of the attitudes that were happening at the hospitals. At least that's how I kind of read it. Yeah.
True.
Excuse me.
I kind of just looked at it, the idea too of, I always feel like rape is a lot of times, or women being on the end of violence from men, it's looked at like they deserved it. What did you do? A friend of mine was an advocate for abused women, and she took somebody whose husband beat her, and she picked her up from a payphone and took her to a police station. This was, 15 years ago. 20 years ago, they walked into the police station and she said this woman was beat by her husband, and the police at the desk said, well, what did she do? And it's like, what do you mean, what did she do? So I think like, and I remember all the narratives about like when like a jogger would be attacked in New York City, it's like, well, Central Park, she's wearing short shorts, and like I think a lot of times they just look at it as you could have avoided it. This is kind of your fault too, and it's not really viewed as something that, sorry, my son is yelling in the background.
You're funny.
Playing video games, but it's just not something that people really jump to. It's not as easy a get for people mentally as like a gunshot or something like that.
I just feel like that goes back to the patriarchal society that we all live in, that, we always kind of come off as second-class citizens with little or no voice, or, that it's always, like you said, it's always our fault or something we've done to exacerbate this, dominant male in our lives.
And then Sarah, if you can kind of talk about like the psychological like aftermath for Renisha, like after that, because like I noticed that like she flinched when her boyfriend tried to touch her knee, and like when she started like her new job, she was like, I'm excited to work with everybody. But then at the end of the film, we see her like so withdrawn, and you know how like can you talk just a little bit about that and how that kind of impacts women? I'm guessing that it's different woman to woman, but just kind of the overall of that.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because it's different from person to person, because every person can be impacted by sexual violence. And I think we often see these different narratives that carry out violence against women. And what we know to be true is that these systems of oppression impact everybody, right? Like the Will's ability to navigate this situation was thwarted by his socialization as a man. Michael thought that, part of his masculinity is linked up with being able to dominate someone else, right? This like power and control dynamic. And Renisha's responses afterward, I think that something that was so powerful about the film is that it was so quiet. So quiet in the way that things took place afterwards, because when we think about trauma, when we think about the impact of sexual violence, I think sometimes we unintentionally perpetuate the narrative of the perfect victim, and that we expect people to behave in certain ways after having been sexually assaulted or sexually harassed or any type of sexual violence, right? The only people who matter are the people who fought back, right? Like that's the legitimate, you were raped because you fought. What we know to be true now, right, in this narrative particularly, was that Renisha was incapacitated. There is also a trauma response, like our trauma response is fight, flight, or freeze. And that's a literal chemical survival skill in our body in order for us to have the most likely outcome of making it out on the other side alive. And so sometimes when these traumatic events are happening, our bodies decide to react without our minds being able to play a role. We don't get a say physically what happens when that fight, or freeze happens. And I think what we saw with Renisha psychologically and physically, the way that she responded to Will touching her is those little moments, right? That she seemed withdrawn, but maybe holding it together. But that moment sparked a memory, or something was going on that brought her back to that moment. And I think when we think about hypervigilance, that can sometimes show up in that way, right? I'm protecting my body at any sign of danger, even though that wasn't a dangerous moment. And then for her leaving her job, some of that is just like maybe just resigning to the fact that like she wasn't going to get justice in a traditional way. She had just gotten off the phone with the police and they said they couldn't do anything for her. And so like, what does her justice look like at this point? How does she move forward now that she was forced into a position of even reporting, and then and re-traumatizing possibly to have to bring that all back to the surface again, just to hear, we can't help you.
I'm glad you brought up kind of like to the point of how she was holding it together, because even just from like the moment after it happened, I kept, thinking like, I know, like you said, you can't like determine how you're going to react in that moment or anything, but I just, I was like, she's not like screaming. She's not like, what's going on? She was very like, kind of like she was thinking to herself, like she couldn't believe this had happened. And I felt like that was kind of how she was the entire film. And maybe even to the point where her boyfriend, Evan, where he's kind of like outraged and exploding and things like that. I think she kind of felt like maybe she had to be the one to hold it together. Even though she was the victim, it's kind of like one of us has to be level-headed in this moment. And I guess she had determined, or maybe that was her way of protecting herself, long term, from having to think about it more. But I just thought I couldn't imagine having just gone through that not even 24 hours ago, and you're just so, I don't want to call her calm, but so held together.
Yeah. It's really interesting too, because if you look at various cases throughout the time, like through different reports and things of that nature, and oftentimes the way that a survivor shows up in reporting spaces is often dictating whether or not they get taken seriously. So if a person is not showing visible, what we anticipate as traumatic responses. So they're not visibly upset, visibly angry, crying, emotional, any of those sorts of things, because oftentimes that doesn't happen. We have to think about like the window of shock that can happen for a person. Oftentimes when we think about trauma responses, we don't think about like indifference or ambivalence, but sometimes if we think often like about when something so big happens and we can't process it, sometimes it just is easier to compartmentalize or act as though it isn't impacting us in the way that it might be. And that's also not to say that every person who survives sexual violence is impacted by trauma, like long-term trauma. Some people, it all depends on, so there's kind of like the 3 E's. So it's like experience, events, effect. And so when there are multiple events in a person's life that have already been traumatic leading up to that moment, it can often exacerbate that particular trauma and bring up those other cues in the past. So experiences, how many events of trauma have happened in a person's life, and then the effect, kind of like what's going on around that person. How does it affect the rest of their life? How has it affected their ability to kind of move forward or thrive in their environment? So if we're thinking about like if a person's impoverished, so they're already dealing with like an ongoing trauma, right? And then they are impacted by sexual violence. They experience a sexually traumatic event. And that makes them unable to show up to their job, kind of like Renisha leaving their job that day, right? They're unable to show up to their job because the trauma is too much for them. And now they're falling further behind on bills. And now they're mounting more of that trauma. So there's really interesting ways that it can show up in our lives. And then it can exacerbate both mental, physical, emotional well-being for a long, long time, because our trauma sits in our tissue, in our bodies, which is really interesting, so that it can then start to really start dictating our social health determinants in the long run. So it's just really interesting the way that trauma shows up for people differently.
I also read her behavior as kind of, and I'm looking at like a broader look at how women are kind of looked at. And I think it's like, if you get a strong man, then he's strong. And if he gets worked up, he's passionate. If you get a woman who is emotional, she's hysterical. So it's that thing of, I think there's a lot of times, whereas women, we feel like we have to keep our emotions in check because we'll be perceived in the wrong way or perceived negatively or dismissed if we show a level of emotion in a moment of crisis. That, oh, well, she needs to be taken care of. She can't handle anything kind of attitude. So I thought I think that's something that came across. And I do believe that there's that kind of delayed response. I was attacked once by a guy, and I got away from him. I fought him off, and I really just was like, eh. And then he showed up at my workplace, and I actually got up and went and hid from him. And my friend found me like 20 minutes later, was like, what do you do? And I was shaking, and I didn't even think that seeing him again would have had that effect. And it had been a couple of months, but it just scared me, terrified me to see him again. And he hadn't done anything, luckily, because I had fought him off. But I can't imagine if something had actually happened and then seeing him, what that would do. So it is weird how you're able to push stuff down, but it will come back up at some point.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm so sorry that happened to you, because I think that we all, oftentimes can recall certain situations in which like something that has caused that kind of like repressed fear to come back up is such like a visceral response that we're also can be scary too, because we didn't anticipate it happening either, or ever having impacted us the way that it had. And I just think about too, I wonder like for Renisha, like what I was seeing, especially when she was talking to Will early on, talking about the nice white women that she'd started working with, right? And not necessarily like, I feel like if we're talking about like race and sexism kind of showing up, like racism and sexism, like that Renisha was like maybe code switching at the hospital as like to minimize not being the loud Black woman, right? And that falling in on herself was the easier option, knowing what could happen if she decided to speak up for herself, was something that struck me in the movie too.
Yeah, I was also interested in like, even with like the boyfriend and like being around like his friends and in his environment, and then when she's with like Amber, you definitely saw like the dynamics and the difference in the way that she kind of conducted herself, for sure. So I definitely think that she definitely was for sure code switching. So I definitely saw that. I can definitely observe the same thing. What about like the part that was interesting to me was like that lack. Okay, so the whole theme of the movie, them going from hospital to hospital, is there a lack of access for women in terms of like for women in terms of healthcare in our country? Does socioeconomic status play a role in that accessibility, or is that just, how does that kind of work as far as like women having access to healthcare in our country,
I mean, it's a great question. I think that it is a huge conversation. I feel like we could go down a rabbit hole about access to healthcare for hours of like how our systems are so broken, particularly for the people who might need it the most. Because when we think about, I really get on a soapbox about trauma and how it shows up generationally for people. If we think about particularly like women's healthcare, so I think about like infant and maternal mortality rates and how they are so much higher oftentimes in Black communities for Black women, particularly because what we know is the lack of agency and the lack of doctors who reflect women's experiences, oftentimes not providing options for a health plan. What does a particular person's health plan look like? And if it differs from what the doctor wants, how do they provide that space? How do people actually even get to those spaces? Oftentimes, so like if we're thinking about Texas, and we're thinking about like reproductive health care, the opportunity to seek out those different access points are hundreds and hundreds of miles in between one another. And some of that could have been that barrier for Renisha, not even knowing because it wasn't being communicated. And I think that oftentimes is the huge gap in particularly women being able to access healthcare, but then also once being in that room, not being believed. There's often this idea that, and I don't know, well, I mean, I guess we could take some, some guesses as to why our healthcare system has evolved to a point where oftentimes professionals think that they know somebody's body better than themselves. And this idea that we aren't our experts in our own lived experiences have often led to very dangerous outcomes for people. And I think we see that show up a lot, particularly in women's healthcare, not being believed, minimizing the pain, and having to deal with that on top of the actual pain that's going on can be incredibly traumatic and lead a person to maybe not seek out the healthcare that they deserve and need in the future. So I definitely think that there's something wrapped up in that, this, belief system that women don't understand their own bodies. And to Kate's point, this idea that they're hysterical, right? We know that historically that's been a way to diminish the real pain or need that somebody might have.
I think to that point, this kind of thing isn't like, preventative medicine or something that you encounter just on your regular life, or that you might, know how to interact or, go through. You don't know the steps, you don't know the process, you don't know if what's happening is by the book or not, or if this is how it should be happening. It's not really something that you can like educate yourself or like, if, goodness, forbid that you end up contracting, a form of cancer. That's something you could study, you could research, you can, figure out like methods of how they might treat you. But I feel like for something like this, like I don't feel like anyone's ever just sat there and like, how would this go, or anything like that. So I feel like it's the unknown of it all too, on top of the trauma and the lack of belief and the everything. It's the unknown.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that, something that brings me to this work particularly is comprehensive sexual health education. And I think that sometimes we forget that it is so wrapped up in being able to eradicate rape culture, because we're often thinking about the logistical pieces, right? Like teaching the scientific part of it, but not teaching the other sides, which is part of comprehensive sex ed, is like consent and healthy relationships and open communication and refusal skills and negotiation skills, right? And how those show up in all parts of our lives, and how those can also show up when we are in the doctor's office. How it can show up saying like, I know that there's something wrong. I'm being able to advocate for ourselves in a way that is tangible, in a way that is the advocacy that other people may not offer in that space. But particularly, I think what's striking is having to advocate in a time of crisis is, nearly impossible, because somebody looks at whatever's happening and they're just reading kind of the all over the place. One trauma response oftentimes is not being able to have a linear storyline, which is oftentimes how holes are poked in reporting. It's like, well, you didn't bring that up before, or, oh, you said that in a different order before. But that's actually like, that is a trauma response for our brains to shut off and then also open up to certain experiences. So like being in a doctor's office trying to advocate, right, in crisis, and not being able to tell the whole story because maybe not ready, maybe because the doctor's not asking the questions in order to open that door. There's so many different barriers that play into, I think, that overall patriarchal structure that we're talking about, that play out in our medical institutions, as well as even in our advocacy spaces. Not all advocacy spaces are rape crisis programs are reckoning with actively right now anti-oppression structures. So, I think it shows up in all of our spaces. Yeah. long conversation about that.
Well, and it really seemed at the beginning like she was an assertive person. She had, like a high level job at a corporation, and she recognized that it was not where she wanted to be, but she took charge and got something that was, closer to home emotionally. And then, like, having her agency taken away, like, that's, I don't know, to have, if you're a strong person and you're caught in that situation, like, the question of, like, well, if I'm strong, how did I let this happen?
Oh, that's a great point.
So it sort of took all the agency away, and like someone else had to advocate, I guess.
And we often, you bring up an important point, is that I was very interested in the fact that an advocate was never called. So there's medical advocates that when a person comes into the hospital, especially into the emergency room, and is reporting that they have been sexually assaulted, there's often protocols set in place for the hospital to immediately call an advocate. One might not always be available in person, but they might be able to get that person on the phone. But I think sometimes we, especially in the midst of trying to advocate on behalf of somebody who may have lost that agency, there's no longer the questions asked like, here are the options, what feels best for you? Here's what's going to happen next. And that's what's so important about an advocate, is that they're able to walk a person through every single step and say, this is what's happening next. Is this okay with you? We can also do this, or we can also wait. I'm happy to stay in the room, or I can step out, particularly for the forensic exam. And I think, especially loved ones, it's especially helpful for loved ones because the advocate can be there to actually help people who have had secondary trauma. So Will likely has what we call secondary trauma because of what's happened, and being able to, maybe the advocate having talked to him would have given Renisha space to process and actually decide what was next for her, what felt best for her to engage in. So that really, it's striking to see how much agency she really did fall kind of into the background of the film toward the end.
Maybe one more question we might be able to get in. I had I don't know, I wanted to see what everyone thought about kind of the openness of the ending. Like, it kind of was like, is she going to go back and, seek to do more with law enforcement? Is she going to seek out therapy? I kind of wondered if her relationship would be able to recover, like if they would be able to move forward, or if it would ever be the same. Would she be the same? And I appreciated they didn't try to wrap it up in a nice, cute bow, because that wasn't the kind of story it was telling. That wasn't the reality of it all. And I think it kind of left it open for you to, think about how she handled the trauma afterwards.
I wondered the same thing. There were such beautiful examples of their relationship prior to that were interspersed after. And just, it was such a change in her that I wondered if she could ever get herself back. It was very powerful.
I thought the same thing, especially because I think it was so sad, because I think Evan was trying so hard to help, and it seemed like he didn't even know how to help or what he could do to like support her. And so like I thought the same thing, like how does a relationship like come back from something like that? And then I can imagine, you know, even from his perspective of like feeling guilty because she asked him to go with her that night. And, you know, maybe is it in his head, like, had I been there, you know, it would not have happened. And then the fact that and the fact that like, even for Renisha, how she wanted to, she wanted to leave. So like, I think on some level throughout the whole like night leading up to the assault, like she kept wanting to leave. I don't want to drink. She kept wanting to, to get out of the situation. So I'm interested too. Like, I don't know how, like, I would imagine that they both would need some type of therapy, one for her to, as a victim, and then one on how he can support her. That's what I would think.
It was interesting. I kind of read the ending like her leaving that job, at least for the day, like, I don't know, I think that was the beauty again of that open-endedness. But to me, it read like almost like a reclamation of agency, that like the things that kept happening to her were at a close. Like the police called and said, like, we're not pursuing your case. And it was something that she was reticent like to do in the first place. And it wasn't her choice, And so, and then it was like looking around of, I don't have to be here right now. Like, I can't be here right now. And so I'm going to go. And it felt important in a way of her stopping in front of the police department to be like, this is a chapter closed in a sense, because like there's nothing else that they can do for me. So like, I'm going to do what I need to for me, was how I read it. And it could have been a totally different intention, but I think that sometimes having that closure of somebody saying like, yeah, we can't do anything might be the thing that drives a person to say, I can move forward now instead of waiting for that answer.
I can also see from and kind of like when she came home and he was waiting for her, I felt like that was a more normal moment for them. So I don't know if those kind of normal moments will continue, if it'll be kind of, like, I'm sure either way it'll be like a struggling point for both of them to get back to where they were prior to, if they can get back to where they were prior to. Yeah. Does anyone else have maybe any final comments, points on the movie? Anything else that they're burning to ask Sarah?
The other point I saw twice was extreme trust. When I'm sorry, I'm not good with the names, but when they first got together and she accepted his invitation. And the other thing that I keep thinking about is when she was in the bar and how influenced she was by her girlfriend. And I wondered, what would other people do? What would I do? How often does that happen? And it just seemed like like you said, she wanted to go home. She doesn't like me. And yet it seemed like her girlfriend wanted to get together with the other guy. And so maybe, I don't know, I'm reading into it, but I thought, well, maybe she's just going along so her girlfriend can have a boyfriend. It just seemed like a level of trust I don't know that I would have in both of those situations.
I definitely agree with you, especially on that second situation with the friend.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I love my friends to death, but I don't want to take these random gummies from this man.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes women, and I've read that like we get into situations where we get that intuition and that gut where we know that like something's not right or something's amiss, and we should take heed more to that sometimes. And I think maybe like Paula said, for the sake of her friend, she kept dismissing that feeling, it seemed like to me. And I definitely agree with Paula. Like Paula, I definitely like picked up on that like she kept dismissing that. Because she had like each time they kept drinking the drug, everything. She's just like, I need to go to work. I need to do this. I have a boyfriend. I don't want to do this. And she was assertive. But like I said, she kind of dismissed that, for the sake of like her friend.
We see it happen all the time. I sometimes think just like, I live by this quote, well, it's not really a quote, but more of a mantra of like, screw politeness. And sometimes like, that if something doesn't feel right, being able to like stop it in its tracks. And if you do need to apologize because you misread the situation, like I think that retroactive apology can be like the safer bet than having agreed to it in the first place. But we see it all the time. Like I know in my, like in my life and having seen folks at college, like do these sorts of things that in a typical situation, like if it were in a controlled situation that like they would have never said yes to it, but that there was social influence and contextual and people having a good time and not wanting to be the buzzkill and not wanting to be the person who gets in the way, like Paula said, of like Amber being able to like cozy up with this guy that she seems to find attractive. Like it can be those moments where we dismiss what is going on in our head and our heart about what doesn't feel okay,
I listen to a true crime podcast because I'm super into that. And they have a saying, be weird, be rude, be alive.
Yeah.
And so sometimes, you think someone's following you, but you don't want to turn around and be like, are you following me? Turn around and say, are you following me? Because that could be the difference, between your life or not.
Yeah.
The number one book I recommend and give as a gift is The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker, which talks exactly about that, about you are given that fear that you feel is a gift, and don't ignore it, embrace it and use it to your advantage, and it will save you.
Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you, Sarah. This was excellent. We really appreciate you taking time and joining us for this. I thought that film was excellent. Thank you, Genevieve at Cinematheque, for helping us to kind of narrow down some films and for working with us to put this out into the public and get the community more involved in Cinematheque, especially now that they're virtual and there's no excuse. You can watch 5 movies in a day if you wanted to. So I recommend that, outside of the film festival, Cinematheque has a variety of films that they show year round. So if you're not familiar, I would go check those out as well. And hopefully you find something else that tickles your fancy.
And I'm just going to quickly drop in the chat if anybody's interested in the work that the Florida Mather Center for Women does, particularly around violence prevention education. We've just launched a new initiative that's campus-wide. You can find it there. It's called It's on Crew. And it's a way to invest in our own community and feel a sense of community responsibility. Because I think that we often think about personal responsibility in those situations, but often we forget that it's actually an impact on our community, whether or not we intervene. So there's a lot of great opportunities to get involved. Everyone, including alumni, are welcome to our trainings, our bystander trainings, as well as our consent and education, all of that. And then if anybody's ever interested, I just put End the Backlog in there. This is a great organization that helps to end the backlog of those forensic exam kits, because there's hundreds of thousands sitting in a backlog and deserve, to be processed for those that want to seek, punitive justice. So, Yeah, thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies. I hope everyone stays safe and has a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Bye.